trying to find a financial advisor is like trying to get Beyonce's number in my circles. It's really interesting because it seems as if people, once you have that person, you don't want other people to have that person, or maybe it's not even that nefarious.
Really?
Oh, I've been trying to find it. It just seems as if once you have that person or that knowledge, maybe I'm in the wrong circles, although I love my friends. But, you know, because when we talk about money, and we were talking about the lack of education around money, then there's wealth. And to accumulate wealth, I think you also need to have more knowledge. I wanted to get an idea from all of you. What's the difference between money versus wealth? Kaylie, I'll start with you.
Ooh, that's it. Okay, big topic. So money is, I think, things that are generally more liquid. We talked about this in the first episode that you can access easily to pay for something else. Wealth would probably include that, or does include that. In addition, you would add, say, stocks, bonds, those sorts of things, the value of your home if you own one, or other assets that you might not be able to change easily for money or sell quickly in order to pay for something else that you wanted instead. And it could be artwork. It might be a cottage. It could be a fancy car that you own, or we talked about those haute couture bags as well in an earlier conversation. And all of those items have value and can add up to wealth.
And Shay?
I would agree. Yeah, I would say it's the same thing.
It's the same thing?
Yeah.
What about you, Craig?
Yeah, I think that describes it. I mean, there's the difference between, you know, your current income versus your accumulated wealth, right? And you could sort of think of it as being like wealth is all of the savings that you've accumulated plus all of the assets that have value, right? Is your personal wealth.
I guess it would be when it comes to money, we kind of have like a blueprint. You go to school, you study, you go to your discipline of choice, profession of choice, and then you start to accumulate money. Is it possible to accumulate wealth? I guess, because I'm thinking accumulating wealth is different from accumulating money. You need more knowledge, you need that other, there's something else, right?
So
Do you understand what I'm saying?
maybe going back to what we first talked about like money being like the actual like coins and bills, et cetera, but wealth is like, well, what do you do with that? So if you have to put it in the right places, you have to utilize the right financial tools to, you know, whether it's investing, whether you're, you know, purchasing a property, whether you start a business. So I think that would be the difference. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm thinking too, you could have a very high income over a long period of time and not have accumulated any wealth, as an example. If you spend it all on things that don't accumulate, you might have had a lot of really great experiences, and that could be a trade-off that you were willing to make, but you wouldn't necessarily have wealth.
And by the same token, there are those people who've been incredibly frugal, maybe not had very high incomes, and put small amounts of savings on a consistent basis away, invested in some cases in something like real estate in a city like Toronto, where we have a huge scarcity of houses and the value of that real estate has gone up massively.
Okay, so saving and investing are not the same thing? Or are they the same thing?
Well, they're related to one another. Saving is, the actual act of taking some portion of your income aside for a rainy day, for the future at some point. That saving can be just held under your mattress, as we talked about earlier. It could be in a savings account, or it could be invested into specific securities, into a business, into some activity that you hope is going to earn a return.
Your wealth can also be affected by your debt, right? So there's you can accumulate wealth by saving, so not spending as much today, so you save for the future, and that accumulates over time, and that's wealth. It could be that you've taken on debt in order to make an investment that then is going to appreciate in value or give you a return on investment that accumulates wealth.
Like a house, typically.
Right.
Well, how does this play out in jurisdictions and provinces and I guess in countries? How do they save and how do they invest, or do they? In what ways do they do that?
Well, we've got quite different rules in different countries around incentives to save. In Canada, for instance, Shay mentioned some of the tax-free savings accounts or registered retirement savings accounts that we have that allow you to put money away and protect it from tax, and that incentive to save is increased by that protection from tax. You also have things like the registered educational savings plan here, where the government matches some portion of what you put away. There are variations on those things in other countries. There are also things like the tax deduction you get on mortgage interest in the United States. That's a huge incentive for people to buy a home and really devote wealth accumulation to the home buying process.
And in Canada, it's you don't pay taxes on the capital gain on your house.
That's right.
So instead of getting a preferred tax rate on the interest that you pay in the United States, in Canada, you don't pay taxes on the amount that your house has appreciated in value. And this is one of the reasons why investments in real estate, personal investments in real estate have been so good over the years, because it's highly attractive on an after-tax basis.
What about the country itself? Like, because we hear sometimes that the taxes are going to go up because they need to cut, I guess, to save more money. Can you explain that to us a little bit?
Well, as we talked about earlier, governments typically borrow over time and run deficits at different periods where the spending that they want to engage in is more than the tax revenue that they're bringing in. The hope is that spending is going to produce more output, more income over time, and allow them to pay that debt back. But if investors are not willing to lend money to countries, and they generally do that by buying the bonds of a government, if they start to think, they've borrowed so much, they're going to have a hard time paying that back, the interest that governments have to pay on new debt issues is going to be bigger. And at some point, potentially investors say, no, you're cut off. We're not going to keep lending to you.
And how do we feel it? Sorry, Kaylie.
Well, just to add to that, I think it's important to remember that governments have some control over their revenue as well. So
What do you mean by that?
That they can raise or lower taxes. For the most part, we see taxes lowering over time, though we have seen a few changes on corporate tax in the last couple of years at the federal level. Generally, we've seen a reduction in taxes over time, which means then that there is less money than there would have been in order to pay for the things government is doing, and that's when they run a deficit. So they could increase their income, if we want to think of it that way, by increasing taxes, which is the money that we all pool together to pay for the society that we want to build.
Craig?
You can actually look at countries and estimate and calculate the wealth of the country. And what's one of the interesting things that's happening on that front is, while traditionally we would basically look at the wealth of a country on the basis of like the land and the structures and the infrastructure that has been built up, increasingly people are now starting to recognize natural wealth and starting to embed that into calculations around the stock of wealth that a country
What do you mean, like
has.
environment?
Yeah. So actually putting one of the reasons why we have historically done more poorly on the environmental front is that there was never a price put on the cost to the environment of things that businesses were doing. So when we calculate what's called a balance sheet for you can look at a balance sheet for a household, which is its assets and liabilities, its assets and its debt. You can look at the same thing for a country and evaluate its assets and its liabilities. Its assets and things like the amount of debt the country is running and the amount of bonds it's issued. But we're now at a point where people are starting to appreciate more the fact that we should also value the natural wealth of the country as well in terms of making those sort of comparisons. So you don't tend to hear about like comparisons of countries on a wealth basis, but you can do it just as you do it for households.
On a personal level, Shay, do you think we should both have savings and investments?
Yes. So I would say saving, like Brett said, is the act of like putting a portion of your money aside. So for example, everybody should have an emergency fund, which is typically 3 to 6 months of expenses in case unexpected expenses come up. In that case, that may be put in the savings account. That wouldn't be earning too much, but the point of that is for it to be easily accessible. And then there's other things like, for example, if I'm saving to travel, I know that that money is going to be depleted at some point. And then there's investing where it's more of a long-term act, and the point of it is to make sure that my money is growing at a rate that can compete with inflation. So there's a place for both. You could maybe say that savings is a more short-term tool, and then investing it could be short-term, mid-term, and or long-term.
Well, when we talk about governments and businesses, how do they know where to invest?
They do a lot of research in the case of individuals and businesses. I mean, they talk to people like Shay, financial advisors who can help them figure out what is an appropriate place to put their money that aligns with their aspirations. You know, if you're someone who perhaps owns a house, you're established, you're not going to use that money anytime soon. You can invest in an asset that has a much longer return horizon on it that might go up and down for short periods, but is going to grow over time. If you're someone who needs that cash back relatively quickly, that's going to imply the need to invest in something that has less risk and less volatility in it.
Kaylie?
To go back to maybe what you're talking about with government, I think when government invests, they're investing in infrastructure. So they're thinking about the type of transportation infrastructure we want to have in the future. The Ontario government has a 30-year plan right now for transportation infrastructure and will make investments periodically over the next 30 years in order to build that infrastructure. And they take taxes in order to do that and also borrow in long-term ways to make that happen, but not so much investing in like a financial asset. It's more in infrastructure.
I don't want to go too left field, but I don't know. I don't know very many people who say that they want their taxes to go up. Do you think we need to have a better understanding of how taxes can actually help the country function better, or the jurisdiction that we're living in better, that it is something that's coming back to us as individuals?
We definitely need a better understanding of that. There's this great book I'm thinking about, maybe written 5 years ago, called Tax is Not a Four-Letter Word. And it explains in great detail.
It took me a second.
It's great. It explains in great detail the benefits that we get from taxes. So in order to invest in creating the country we want to live in order to invest in the education that is required for all of the people in society to continue to keep up with technological changes, things going on in the labor market, we need to be spending on education. We need people to be healthy and have access to preventative medicine, a high quality of life that leads to fewer illness, and then also to be able to take care of illnesses that happen. People are healthy, we're thriving, we have great community relationships, we can go to work every day and do our jobs, and all of that actually does take money. Somehow we've separated those two ideas, and taxes have been vilified when in fact they pay for all sorts of things and make each of those things cheaper than if we bought it in the private
Kind
market.
of investments, in a way.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, there are some economies of scale when we buy things together as a collectivity. Often we can get better prices for them than if we're each contracting individually.
Like buying in bulk?
Buying in bulk, yeah. You know, that family size, gets you a lower cost per
Totally.
unit. That's certainly the case on drug purchases by provincial medical care plans, for instance. And so I think, Kaylie makes a great point. It's not so much the rate or the level of taxation, but what is the value it's buying for us? And of course, at the extremes, you might be able to make very strong arguments for or against very high or very low tax rates. But in the middle, it requires a very careful analysis of what value you're getting, particularly when you compare one jurisdiction against another. Some people like to compare Canadian tax rates to American tax rates. That's an interesting comparison, but it's
Interesting or folly?
Well, it's interesting and potentially a folly if you don't actually also look at what it gets you. A comparable Canadian tax rate in Ontario to one in New York City is getting you better public services, getting you a lower public sector university tuition, more access to healthcare, and more access to social services. So it might look like good value.
Yeah, I think it was, and I hope I'm going to get this right, but I think it was Oliver Wendell Holmes who said, taxes is the price for living in a civilized society, right? So, we pay taxes so that we have the healthcare, the education, the key priorities from the public sector that Canadians want and deserve. One of the challenges in terms of the communication that we hear from government, though, is Canadians aren't, no Canadian's going to say, I want my taxes to go up. So what tends to happen is the governments want to make lots of promises to their people. They want to say, hey, I'm going to invest in this, I'm going to put in money into this area, and here's the benefits we're going to get. But they don't actually want to say, but we're going to increase taxes to actually pay for those benefits. And it's because that politically you tend to have a break between those two, that we don't necessarily have the national conversation we should have, the adult conversation around, okay, is this money well spent? Well, if it's money well spent, well then the tax money should go to that. But that's not the way the political system tends to talk to the electorate.
I want to shift gears a little bit. You mentioned it before. I think I want to talk about opportunity costs when you're deciding to get an education. Before it was you go to college, university, you will get that great job and you'll be able to pay off your debt. But it's happening a lot where, with the Great Recession, people graduated, there wasn't jobs, and then they had these huge debts where it's like you're starting your professional life choked down with debt. So Shay, what factors should someone consider when deciding whether to attend university, college, or even to seek an apprenticeship?
Right. So things are changing for sure, and I really, as much as honestly, people should do whatever their heart desires. I went to post-secondary and it was great, but I think now we have to think about sustainable careers or sustainable industries and what that looks like in terms of like, okay, we're gonna go to school and study what is gonna be the outcome of that. If a pandemic happens, is my career or ideal job going to be something I can still do? We also have to think of considering self-employment and starting businesses and creating additional income, because now one income isn't enough. So I think it's really what's a sustainable career, the skills that you learn in the field that you choose, how transferable they are. Yeah, I don't know if anyone else wants to add.
I think there are a lot of models of financing education that need to be looked at and expanded in Canada. We've kind of taken glances at them in the past, but we haven't fully developed them. Things like income contingent student loans, where you take out a loan, you have full access to the education you want to pursue, and then the amount you pay back over time is really related to how much money you're making. So if you get a degree in law, say, and you decide to be a public defender or work in an NGO on local activism, you're not making much money, you're going to pay a very much smaller amount back over time than someone who's landed in a very high-paying corporate job. And there should be some capacity within our system to relate the repayment stream to the income that you're earning and ensure that there isn't a barrier up front to getting education.
Does that happen here now? Because I know like the minute you finish school, I think you get like 3 months grace before you start paying your...
It doesn't happen here in a substantial way, but it's something we talked about when I was a student in the 90s, and we haven't fully pursued. Countries like Australia have strongly income contingent public loan systems for students. That's something we should expand, particularly because inflation in the education sector, particularly for post-secondary education, has been far higher than inflation for the rest of the economy. So you've seen tuition fees go up massively faster than prices for other things.
Why is that? So I know, Kaylie, I'm going to come to you, but why is that? Why is it going up higher?
I don't think I have a good explanation for that, but there's
supply
clearly,
issues. Sorry.
Well, there's clearly, it's not supply issues.
That just seems to be the answer these days. Sorry.
But, there's been a lack of cost controls for sure, but there has also been a lack of funding going into the education sector. In Ontario, particularly, you had a freeze and a cut on tuition imposed on universities and colleges, and that's meant that they've had to scramble for money from other sources. And that's why you've seen the share of international students in our local post-secondary institutions go up so much, because they're not bound by those freezes and cuts.
And I think that implementing different policies than the ones that are in place today changes the opportunity cost for people. So if we had income contingent repayments or just more public sector investment in college and university, in skilled trades, apprenticeships, it would mean that people would be more willing to take the risk. At the same time, or on the other side, making sure that the quality of employment, no matter what job you get, keeps up with the cost of getting into a particular field is also really important. So your ability to pay back is partially contingent on how much it costs and partially contingent on how much you earn. And in a lot of cases, the quality of your job hasn't necessarily kept up either. What you were talking about in terms of like starting a business or and you didn't mention this, but getting starting a side hustle or something in order to be able to make ends meet is something that's happening more and more. So if we were to make different policy choices, then the opportunity cost is different, and we can make different choices as individuals too.
Can you give us a definition of opportunity cost?
Ooh, just how much something costs today or in the future compared to the payoff, I think is where I would go with that. So you might look at a chocolate bar. Like if I buy that chocolate bar now, I have $2 in my pocket, I buy that chocolate bar now, I know that I'm gonna crash later because of my sugar high, but I won't have any money left to, buy an apple or something that I need to carry me over. You're spending all of that now and you don't have something later.
But we just to be very clear, yes, student debt has increased and tuition has increased a lot. Investing in post-secondary education is the single best investment you can make. It from a point of view of success in the labor market, there was a time when all you needed was high school. If you don't get a college diploma or a university degree, if you look at the unemployment rates for people with that level of education, it's if you don't get post-secondary education, it's going to close an awful lot of doors. Now, there's questions around what is the income stream that you're going to get after graduation, and I think one of the problems we have is we don't educate our children enough about what life will look like after you graduate from a program. I mean, I think a lot of kids go into programs based on what they're interested in or what they like.
Maybe what their parents want to.
Or even what their parents prefer. We certainly see that with the trades. Like we don't have enough people in the trades, but that's because an awful lot of parents want their kids to go to university, not to college.
But you just said right? Kids should pursue post-secondary career.
Post-secondary is university or college. What I'm saying is investing in post-secondary education of some form is the single best investment you can make. It'll give you the highest rate of return of any other investment you make, right? So it is an enormous enabler. Now, having said that, if you graduate from different programs or different trades, it gives you a different income stream. And that's where I think we often fall down, because kids won't know. Like they'll say, I want to pursue music because I'm interested in music. Well, let's have a conversation of, if you graduate in music, what your life is going to be like what your employment opportunities are going to look like if you graduate from that program.
Or if you take journalism.
Right? So in countries like Germany, they often streamline kids very early in their lives in terms of what educational path they go down. And I don't really like that streamlining.
They do that in Ontario. I mean, they're starting to stop it, but.
I really I still believe in free choice. I just think we need to make sure kids are making an informed choice.
Just to add, just to add on that though, informed choice, I think that directly ties into going to post-secondary might not be the best choice if someone is going to go into a lot of debt for the possibility that they're not going to get the great paying job that they anticipated versus maybe, for example, like I have my financial advisor license, investment costs probably under $600 to start. Yes, there's cost along the way, but now I'm in control of the income that I can make, essentially. So I think it's really just dependent on, I just think now, in the world we live in now, we definitely need to be more open-minded on the route that we're going to obtain these different jobs. Again, I went to post-secondary, great experience, but if I knew about getting into the financial services industry through the platform that I did, with the costs that it cost, I don't know if I would have went to post-secondary. So as much as, you're saying that it's, I guess, the best, it gives you the best outcome, I think now we have to start thinking that maybe it doesn't.
I just think that what ends up happening is, like, we had this happen in Alberta when the oil boom was really high. You could get a really good paying job in the oil patch, making lots of money with a high school. And then oil prices crashed, and a lot of those young workers weren't employable in other sectors, right? Because they didn't go on and get an education before they went into the. So I think it tends to be like there's a significant cost. It can incur significant debt. But ultimately, I think that the labor market has changed in a way where a post-secondary education is the minimum level of education to succeed in a knowledge-based economy.
Kaylie?
It's worth.
Oh, sorry.
So many things. In terms of the labor market, I think it's really important to go back to considering the quality of jobs that are available. So if you think of someone who studies music or any form of art, creates so much beauty and so much value for our society, and we don't value it very well in terms of what we pay people to do it. And in that way, that actually is the thing that needs to change, I think, not the deciding to follow your dream and study music or theater. So focusing on improving the incomes that people will earn by increasing wages, unionizing particular sectors, so people have the power to bargain collectively to ask for more without undercutting each other. I think those are really important things so that people can make the opportunity cost decision in a way that means they're living their dream in the end.
And Brett?
Well, we've been talking a lot about the personal decision to invest in a post-secondary education for, either community college skills training or university training, but as a society, we know consistently the biggest returns on education are at the early childhood level and early elementary level. Those returns pay off over someone's entire life.
I think in the same way, we could consider making college, university, apprenticeship education free or much cheaper, so that that opportunity cost decision becomes much different, and people can choose to chase the dream that they want.
I wish we could talk about this more, but we have to wrap up. Thank you so much for your passion and for your expertise. Tomorrow will be our final discussion, and we're going to be talking about what is a market and how we make the choices that we make. Thanks so much. Our guests all this week are
Shay Myers, licensed financial advisor and educator of Finance for the Culture. Craig Alexander, president of Alexander Economic Views. Brett House, professor of economics at Columbia Business School and fellow at the Public Policy Forum. And Kaylie Tiessen, economist and policy analyst at Unifor, one of the unions that represents some employees here at TVO.
The agenda in the summer with Nam Kiwanuka is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.